Loss and Gain. This short novel written by Newman. Here's one of my copies of it. Kind of an old little paperback. You can see it's not too big. Published originally in 1848, 3 years after his conversion, this short nonfiction work is a pseudo-autobiographical account of Newman's own conversion. It is not really Newman's story, but you can get a glimpse of what Newman was feeling and thinking in the years just before he became Catholic. Loss and Gain tells the story of Charles Redding, a young Oxford student who tries to avoid cliques and religious factions, but at length he finds that he is feeling inclined toward Catholicism. Redding arrives at Oxford University planning to follow the advice and example of his father and to submit to the teachings of the Church of England without becoming involved in any factions. Initially, Redding is inclined toward a form of latitudinarianism, those who believe that it was not necessary and could be harmful to adhere to any specific doctrines, liturgical practices, or church organizational forms, as did the Puritans. His conversations with his friend Sheffield convince him, however, that there must be right and wrong answers in doctrinal matters. To follow the right views, Redding seeks a source of church authority and is disappointed to find only party dissension and extreme Protestantism. Furthermore, Redding begins to have doubts about the 39 Articles to which he must subscribe to take his degree. His doubts are briefly dispelled following the death of his father, but return soon afterward. In particular, several brief encounters with Willis, a former Oxford peer who converted to Catholicism, greatly excite and trouble him. Redding confesses his doubts to his sister Mary, who does not understand them and loses trust in her brother. When Redding finally decides he must convert, his sister Mary, his mother, and several family friends express resentment and anger. Newman actually uses the phrase, coming out of shadows into realities, which is a foretaste of Newman's own epitaph, to describe Redding's gradual conversion. Redding travels to London, and on the train ride he receives encouragement from a Catholic priest, the first priest he has ever met. While in London, Redding is confronted by emissaries from various religious and philosophical sects, who, hearing about his departure from the Anglican Church, want to recruit him for their own causes. Ultimately, however, Redding arrives at the Passionists monastery, where he joins the Catholic Church. And remember, Blessed Dominic Barbary was a Passionist, and he helped Newman become Catholic too. On the train, Redding has the following conversation with the Catholic priest, this portion coming at the end. Quote, his companion looked round him curiously, and then said quietly, depend on it, there is quite evidence enough for a moral conviction that the Catholic or Roman Church, and none other, is the voice of God. Do you mean, said Charles with a beating heart, that before conversion one can attain to a present abiding actual conviction of this truth? I do not know, answered the other, but at least he may have habitual moral certainty. I mean a conviction, and one only steady, without rival conviction, or even reasonable doubt, present to him when he is most composed and in his hours of solitude, and flashing on him from time to time as through clouds when he is in the world. A conviction to this effect, the Roman Catholic Church is the one only voice of God, the one only way of salvation. Then you mean to say, said Charles, while his heart beat faster, that such a person is under no duty to wait for clearer light. The priest said, he cannot expect clearer light before conversion. Certainty, in its highest sense, is the reward of those who, by an act of the will and at the dictate of reason and prudence, embrace the truth, when nature, like a coward, shrinks. You must make a venture. Faith is a venture before a man is a Catholic. It is a gift after it. You approach the church in the way of reason. You enter into it in the light of the Spirit. There was nothing in all this exactly new to Redding, but it was pleasant to hear it from the voice of another, and him a priest. Thus he had sympathy and authority, and felt he was restored to himself. The conversation stopped. After a while he disclosed to his new friend the place for which he was bound, which, after what Charles had already been saying, could be no great surprise to him. The latter knew the superior of Saint Michel, and taking out a card, wrote upon it a few words of introduction for him. By this time they had reached Paddington, and scarcely had the train stopped when the priest took his small carpet bag from under his seat, wrapped his cloak around him, stepped out of the carriage, and was walking out of sight at a brisk pace. So that's the end of the quote from Loss and Gain. Later in the book, Redding goes to that Passionist monastery and enters the church before Mass begins. He waits there through Mass, very impressed, and Newman writes, while he was thus thinking, a change came over the worship. A priest, or at least an assistant, had mounted for a moment above the altar and removed a chalice or vessel which stood there. He could not see distinctly. A cloud of incense was rising on high. The people suddenly all bowed low. What could it mean? The truth flashed on him, fearfully yet sweetly. It was the Blessed Sacrament. It was the Lord incarnate who was on the altar, who had come to visit and bless his people. It was the great presence which makes the Catholic Church different from every other place in the world, which makes it, as no other place can be, holy. In the last pages of Loss and Gain, Newman writes, a very few words will conduct us to the end of our history. It was Sunday morning about 7 o'clock, and Charles had been admitted into the communion of the Catholic Church about an hour since. He was still kneeling in the church of the Passionists before the tabernacle, in the possession of a deep peace and serenity of mind, which he had not thought possible on earth. It was more like the stillness which almost sensibly affects the ears when a bell that has long been tolling stops, or when a vessel, after much tossing at sea, finds itself in harbor. It was such as to throw him back in memory on his earliest years, as if he were really beginning life again. But there was more than the happiness of childhood in his heart. He seemed to feel a rock under his feet. It was the soliditas cathedrae Petri, the solidity of the chair of Peter. He went on kneeling as if he were already in heaven, with the throne of God before him, and angels around, and as if to move were to lose his privilege. And then Redding meets his old friend from Oxford, Willis, who is now a Passionist priest, Father Aloysius by name, and they have a joyful reunion in the last dialogue of the book, which ends with this, quote, Redding took Father Aloysius's hand and kissed it, and as he sank on his knees, the young priest made the sign of blessing over him. Then he vanished through the door of the sacristy, and the new convert sought his temporary cell, so happy in the present that he had no thoughts either for the past or the future. End quote. I think this thin book is one of Newman's most approachable works. It is a clever story, funny at times, and the sense of joy you get at the end is very moving. In this book, we can see Newman's heart and mind during his conversion. He seems to show feelings of confusion, doubt, hesitation, and uncertainty. Then at last, after his conversation with the priest, moral conviction to become Catholic. At the Mass, he feels awe, reverence, and wonder. Finally, peace, serenity of mind, and stability. And finally, friendship and fraternity. As a convert also myself, I felt this same variety of emotions at some point or another during my journey home. I'll just pause there for comments. The Apologia Pro Vita Sua, written by Newman in 1864 and 65. This religious let me start that over. This religious autobiography is not an apology in the sense of saying sorry, but it is a defense of his life. That's what Apologia Pro Vita Sua means. Newman felt that he had to defend himself against numerous attackers who called him a hypocrite and a liar. The chief attacker and immediate cause of Newman writing the Apologia was Charles Kingsley. An Anglican priest and a Cambridge professor, Kingsley was one of the fiercest opponents of Newman and the Tractarians. He was a, quote, broad church Anglican, also known as a latitudinarian. These middle-of-the-road Anglicans were moderates, neither high church Anglo-Catholics nor evangelical Protestants. Kingsley believed in tolerance of all forms of Anglicanism, as long as it was Protestant, and he believed in inclusivity, as long as it did not include Roman Catholics. Kingsley wrote an article in a magazine that included the following claim, quote, "Truth for its own sake had never been a virtue with the Roman clergy. Father Newman informs us that it need not, and on the whole ought not to be. Whether his notion be doctrinally correct or not, it is at least historically so." End quote. This greatly offended Newman, and he wrote to the editor of the magazine, which set off a chain reaction and a long series of letters between Newman and Kingsley, which are now public. Newman wrote a very sarcastic and witty pamphlet, to which Kingsley answered with his own pamphlet titled, "What then does Dr. Newman mean?" In this pamphlet, Kingsley wrote, quote, "I am henceforth in doubt and fear, as much as an honest man can be, concerning every word Dr. Newman may write. Yes, I am afraid that I must say it once more. Truth is not honored among these men for its own sake. And so I leave Dr. Newman only expressing my fear that if he continues to economize and, quote, divide the words of his adversaries as he has done mine, he will run great danger of forfeiting once more his reputation for honesty." End quote. Newman then set to work to fully defend himself, to explain what he meant, and to end the debate with Kingsley. Kingsley's last pamphlet had appeared on March 30th, 1864, and the fully mobilized and energized Newman published his first reply pamphlet 3 weeks later on April 21st. Newman published 8 pamphlets in total over the course of that year. These were titled Mr. Kingsley's Method of Disputation, True Mode of Meeting Mr. Kingsley, History of My Religious Opinions up to 1833, History of My Religious Opinions from 1833 to 1839, etc., from 1839 to 41, and finally from 1841 to 45. A second edition of these pamphlets were published in 1865 as a book. This version omitted the first 2 polemical parts directed at Kingsley, which were replaced by a preface, and it had an appendix containing a series of notes, none of which referred to Kingsley. These notes are on topics like liberalism, miracles, the Anglican Church, and lying. The 1865 edition also has a chapter called Position of My Mind Position of My Mind since 1845. From this chapter we read, quote, "I am going to take upon myself the responsibility of more than mere creed of the Church, as the parties accusing me are determined I shall do. They say that now, in that I am a Catholic, though I may not have offenses of my own against honesty to answer for, yet, at least I am answerable for the offenses of others, of my co-religionists, of my brother priests, of the Church herself." Starting then with the being of a God, Newman says, which, as I have said, is as certain to me as the certainty of my own existence, though when I try to put the grounds of that certainty into logical shape, I find a difficulty in doing so in mood and figure to my satisfaction. I look out of myself into the world of men, and there I see a sight which fills me with unspeakable distress. The world seems simply to give the lie to that great truth, of which my whole being is so full, and the effect upon me is, in consequence, as a matter of necessity, as confusing as if it denied that I am in existence myself. If I looked in a mirror and did not see my face, I should have the sort of feeling which actually comes upon me when I look into this living, busy world and see no reflection of its Creator. This is to me one of those great difficulties of this absolute primary truth to which I referred just now. Were it not for this voice speaking so clearly in my conscience and in my heart, I should be an atheist or a pantheist or a polytheist when I looked into the world. I am speaking for myself only, and I am far from denying the real force of the arguments in proof of a God, drawn from the general facts of human society and the course of history. But these do not warm me or enlighten me. They do not take away the winter of my desolation, or make the buds unfold and the leaves grow within me, and my moral being rejoice. Continuing the quote. I am defending myself here from a plausible charge brought against Catholics, as will be seen better as I proceed. The charge is this: that I, as a Catholic, not only make profession to hold doctrines which I cannot possibly believe in my heart, but that I also believe in the existence of a power on earth which, at its own will, imposes upon men any new set of credenda when it pleases, by a claim to infallibility. In consequence, that my own thoughts are not my own property, that I cannot tell that tomorrow I may not have to give up what I hold today, and that the necessary effect of such a condition of mind must be a degrading bondage, or a bitter inward rebellion relieving itself in secret infidelity, or the necessity of ignoring the whole subject of religion in a sort of disgust, and of mechanically saying everything that the Church says and leaving to others the defense of it. These are the charges as Newman sees them, charges against himself. Newman answers the charges, quote, I am quite willing to accept the responsibility, and as I have been able, as I trust by means of a few words, to dissipate in the minds of all those who do not begin with disbelieving me, the suspicion with which so many Protestants start in forming their judgment of Catholics, namely, that our creed is actually set up in inevitable superstition and hypocrisy as the original sin of Catholicism. So now I will proceed as before, identifying myself with the Church and vindicating it, not of course denying the enormous mass of sin and error which exists of necessity in that worldwide multiform communion, but going to the proof of this one point, that its system is in no sense dishonest, and that therefore the upholders and teachers of that system as such have a claim to be acquitted in their own persons of that odious imputation. End quote. One of the doctrines that Newman is most famous for is that of conscience. I see Apologia as a detailed look into Newman's conscience. Newman explains himself and his beliefs at these various stages in his life in such a detailed way that you can't help but admire him for his honesty and transparency. As he wrote in Apologia, quote, a man in his own person is guided by his own conscience, but in drawing out a system of rules he is obliged to go by logic and to follow the exact deduction of conclusion from conclusion, and must be sure that the whole system is coherent and one. End quote. It is that profound and wonderful synthesis, that human blending of Newman's heart and his conscience, that makes him so appealing to many, including myself. On his conversion, Newman wrote, I have nothing more to say on the subject of the change in my religious opinions. On the one hand, I came gradually to see that the Anglican Church was formally in the wrong. On the other, that the Church of Rome was formally in the right. Then, that no valid reasons could be assigned for continuing in the Anglican, and again that no valid objections could be taken to joining the Roman. Then I had nothing more to learn. What still remained for my conversion was not a further change of opinion, but to change opinion itself into the clearness and firmness of intellectual conviction. Just a word about Newman's satire here. Newman had a keen wit, dry sense of humor, and he was a brilliant satirist. Just an example of this from Apologia, referring to Kingsley, he wrote, he need not commit himself to a definite accusation against me, such as requires definite proof and admits of definite refutation, for he has two strings to his bow, When he is thrown off balance on the one leg, he can recover himself by the use of the other. If I demonstrate that I am not a knave, he may exclaim, "Oh, but you are a fool." And when I demonstrate that I am not a fool, he may turn around and retort, "Well then, you are a knave." End quote. With Apologia, Newman won the war with Kingsley. The book was a hit with the public, and Kingsley became bitterly resentful at Newman's success. Newman himself was rather surprised by the success of Apologia and said, "I fancy I write better when I am led to write by what comes in my way, or rather I am sure to make failures if I go out of my work." Amazingly, both Catholics and Anglicans responded favorably to the book. One Anglican priest remarked on how charitably the Church of England had been treated by Newman. Apologia raised a new interest in Newman and sympathy for him nationwide, especially at Oxford. Newman briefly considered leaving Birmingham and returning to his beloved university town in the years following Apologia's publication. Turning a heated debate into a defense of his life, Newman turned conflict into opportunity, and we are all blessed for him doing so. An interesting side story. In 1875, Charles Kingsley died an early death, which shocked many, including Newman. Newman could honestly say he had never felt anger against him. Newman said a mass for his old adversary, who he heard had preached about him in a kindly if critical way a few years previously. By his passionate attack on him, Kingsley had inadvertently become one of his best friends. Newman said, "Whom I always wished to shake hands with when living, and towards whose memory I have much tenderness." End quote. I'd like to talk about two works of Newman on St. Athanasius from 1842 and 1881. Newman explains his second treatises on St. Athanasius in the advertisement. Because he was working for Dr. Pusey in the first edition, he was bound to translate the Greek literally. Now, why would he feel bound in that way? He explains the reason for this in these words, quote, "Those who at that date took part in Dr. Pusey's great undertaking were regarded with much suspicion both by Catholics and Protestants, as if they were introducing the Fathers to the English public with a covert view of recommending thereby certain religious theories of their own." Close quote. So to avoid any translator bias, actual or perceived, Newman did a literal translation in the first edition. In the second edition, from 1881, Newman was working for himself under no authority other than his own, so he made what he called a free translation. He said that he thought it was possible, quote, "to make a volume unexceptionable in itself and sufficiently distinct from the one published in Dr. Pusey's series, and with a usefulness of its own, though I did not follow Athanasius's text sentence by sentence, allowing myself in abbreviation where he was diffuse and in paraphrase where he was obscure." End quote. So I just think this is interesting to see Newman's talent at translation and the English language in this little comparison between two passages from St. Athanasius. Translated first literally, he says, "For irreligiousness is utterly forbidden, though it be attempted to disguise it with artful expressions and plausible sophisms. But religiousness is confessed by all to be lawful, even though presented in strange phrases, provided only they are used with a religious view and a wish to make them the expression of religious thoughts." End quote. So the same original text Newman translated in this way later on in his free translation. "Disguise it as you will by artful terms and plausible sophisms, impiety is a sin, but represent the truth under ever so strange a formula, while it is truth, it is at least piety." So there you go. Much shorter, concise, maybe more direct. I thought that was interesting. Now let's look at Newman's poetry, beginning, of course, with "The Dream of Gerontius." This 1865 poem is the personal and spiritual story of a dying man, Gerontius, whose name in Latin simply means old man. The man dies, and his soul is escorted by his guardian angel through judgment and toward purgatory, past some demons who taunt him, and then into the presence of some angelic choirs, but finally to purgatory with other souls who are aided by their angels. It is a long poem, not on the scale of Dante's Divine Comedy, but over 10 pages if one were to print it out from newmanreader.org. There are 12 characters or parts in the poem, including the soul of Gerontius, his priest, his angel, some demons, and 5 different choirs of angels. It begins by Gerontius on his deathbed, asking those around him for their prayers because he cannot pray for himself. He expresses his faith in the famous words that have become a favorite, well-known hymn. You've probably sung it yourself. Firmly I believe and truly God is three and God is one, and I next acknowledge duly manhood taken by the Son. And I trust and hope most fully in that manhood crucified, and each thought and deed unruly, due to death as he has died. Simply to his grace and holy light and life and strength belong, and I love, supremely solely, him the holy, him the strong. A priest is there, and he prays the Propitiare. Quote, Go forth upon thy journey, Christian soul, go from this world. Go in the name of God, the omnipotent Father who created thee. Go in the name of Jesus Christ our Lord, who, the Son of the living God, who bled for thee. Go in the name of the Holy Spirit, who hath been poured out on thee. Gerontius then dies, and his soul feels a strange refreshment, and he hears the prayers of the priest. Later in the poem, we hear the first choir of angelicals singing the hymn that is also in many of our hymnals today. Praise to the holiest in the height, and in the depth be praise, in all his words most wonderful, most sure in all his ways. To us his elder race he gave, to battle and to win, without the chastisement of pain, without the soil of sin. And there's 3 more stanzas after that. Each of the 5 choirs of angels sings a slightly different set of verses of this hymn, but the first verse is always the same. Praise to the holiest in the height, and in the depth be praise, in all his words most wonderful, most sure in all his ways. The guardian angel says farewell to Gerontius's soul in the last 2 stanzas of the poem, saying, Angels to whom the willing task is given shall tend and nurse and lull thee as thou liest, and masses on the earth and prayers in heaven shall aid thee at the throne of the Most Highest. Farewell, but not forever, brother dear. Be brave and patient on thy bed of sorrow. Swiftly shall pass thy night of trial here, and I will come and wake thee on the morrow. Little bit of irony there that Newman, in the angel's voice, uses masses plural, when in track 90 he was so careful to say that masses plural was a superstitious Roman doctrine. I don't know. That's the first time I've noticed that. That just struck me just then. I don't usually say that in these talks, but masses on earth shall aid thee at the throne of the Most Highest. Maybe I'll add that into the talk. What this poem shows about Newman is his deep Catholic sense of the supernatural, of what happens after death, and the efficacy of both prayers and masses for the dead. It's a compliment to his poetry that 2 hymns were derived from this poem, and they found their way into the Episcopal Church's 1940 hymnal, the St. Michael hymnal, and over 130 other hymnals, according to the website hymnary.org. It's also was turned into an oratorio by Sir Edward Elgar, a long piece of music that I haven't listened to the whole thing, but apparently when it was first performed in England was not received too well, but I think that was because of the Catholic doctrines therein. But Yeah, Elgar wrote a whole Dreamodrontius oratorio. Shifting gears slightly in terms of Newman's poetry, published in 1867, Verses on Various Occasions has over 170 poems, hymns, and verses by Newman as original works or translations. And that Verses is within this book by Ignatius Press, Prayers, Verses, and Devotions. Has all that which I just mentioned, 170 poems, hymns, and verses in this copy, or other places too. You can get them elsewhere as well. Number 90, ironically, is titled by Newman The Pillar of the Cloud, but its more familiar name will become obvious once I begin to read it. Lead, kindly light, amid the encircling gloom, lead thou me on. The night is dark, and I am far from home. Lead thou me on. Keep thou my feet, I do not ask to see the distant scene, one step enough for me. I was not ever thus, nor prayed that thou shouldst lead me on. I love to choose and see my path, but now lead thou me on. I loved the garish day, and, spite of fears, pride ruled my will, remember not past years. So long thy power hath blessed me, sure it still will lead me on, o'er moor and fen, o'er crag and torrent, till the night is gone. And with the morn those angel faces smile, which I have loved long since, and lost a while. At sea, June 16th, 1833. This was a poem Newman wrote while returning by ship from the Mediterranean trip he took, during which he visited Rome and was enthralled with its beauty, but also the same trip during which he almost died in his hike across Sicily. Hymns. Newman translated the Latin hymns in the Roman Breviary into beautiful English. He did this as an Anglican from 1836 to 38 as a study of the Roman Breviary, which he published as tract number 75. This tract was intended to convince Anglicans of the excellence and beauty of the, quote, lost treasure that is the Breviary. By giving a taste of the Breviary to readers in English, Newman hoped to reappropriate the services that had been lost to the whole church as he saw it. One example is the Compline hymn, Te Lucis ante terminum. His version is in the 8686 meter, the common meter, same as Praise to the Holiest in the Height, Amazing Grace, and O God, our help in ages past, instead of the original 8888 long meter of the Te Lucis ante terminum. I shall read his 3 verses of the Compline hymn. Now that the daylight dies away, by all thy grace and love, thee, maker of the world, we pray, to watch our bed above. Let dreams depart and phantoms fly, the offspring of the night. Keep us like shrines beneath thine eye, pure in our foes' despite. This grace on thy redeemed confer, Father, co-equal Son, and Holy Ghost the Comforter, eternal 3 in 1. Now I'll share with you the handout, which I should have shared earlier on, but I forgot. And what I do when I have the class meeting in person is we all now look at the handout and we sing together the hymn on the second page, but that's not going to work over Zoom. So I'll just show you what I'm talking about. It's kind of interesting. Sharing my screen here, which is the second page of the handout. This is the hymn for Sunday Vespers from the Roman Breviary, translated by Newman, Lucis Creator Optime, in the common meter, which you can sing to the tune Newman, Praise of the Holiest in the Height. However, I tried to do so. The very first time we sang this, we realized that these 2 stanzas with the lines to the left of them do not fit the common meter. So I think the second line at least is not 6 syllables. So we just sing the one verse first, second verse, and third verse, or fifth verse here, the last one. So that's kind of interesting that the syllable count is off in these 2 stanzas. But anyway. Now let's look at Newman's letters briefly. Newman was a prolific letter writer, and he saved all his letters that he wrote and received. Remember, there was no email back then, all pen and paper. These letters are available in a 31-volume set compiled by Father Charles Desane of the Birmingham Oratory, called The Letters and Diaries of John Henry Newman, published over the course of 23 years starting in 1961. These letters have been invaluable to Newman scholars and have led to new insights into Newman's life. One example of Newman's letters is this one I'm about to read, written at the age of 10 as the Christmas holidays approached in December of 1811. This is from Ian Carr's book, Definitive Biography of Newman, which he based mostly off of Newman's letters. Newman says, "Dear Aunt, the joyful 21 again approaches when our books are closed according to delightful custom, and when I hope for the additional pleasure of seeing you all well and happy at home. Already in imagination I pay my respects to the mince pies, turkeys, and the other good things of Christmas. In the meantime, the notches on my wooden calendar diminish apace, but not so the duty and affection with which I am, dear Aunt, yours ever, John H. Newman." He's 10 years old when he wrote that cute little letter. Very Newman-esque in its prose, I must say. I'm not going to talk about all his letters, but I would like to point out one that is interesting to me personally and to anyone in the ordinariate, especially those at Mount Calvary Church in Baltimore. And I'll have to share my screen again. It's on the handout. The very last thing on the handout is this letter Newman wrote. I, John Henry Newman, Superior of the Oratory of St. Philip Neri in Birmingham, certify that Alfred Paul Curtis of Baltimore, in the United States of America, sometime a minister of the Protestant Episcopal Church, was received by me to the church on the 18th April, 1872, having previously made abjuration of his errors and received conditional baptism in my presence, John H. Newman, the Oratory, Birmingham, 10 May, 1872. So what is this about? Why am I sharing this with you? Who is Alfred Paul Curtis of Baltimore? Well, he was an Episcopal priest in the Episcopal Diocese of Maryland, and from I think 1865 to 71, he was the rector of Mount Calvary Church, which is now an ordinary parish in Baltimore, and it's my home parish. And so Father Curtis, while he was rector at Mount Calvary Church, was influenced by the Oxford movement, and he really was trying to have Mount Calvary be very Anglo-Catholic. They had daily mass. They said the rosary together, and he wore a cassock and biretta. And he became convinced himself that he had to leave the Episcopal Church and become Catholic, and following in the footsteps of Newman. And so Father Curtis, then I guess you could call him Mr. Curtis, left the Episcopal Church, went to England, toured around England, meeting with different spiritual directors, and especially Father Newman. John Henry Newman, superior of the oratory. They met in person, and Newman convinced Curtis to become Catholic right there and then to go back to Baltimore and submit himself to the Archbishop of Baltimore and discern a call to the priesthood in the Catholic Church. So that's what this letter is about, from Newman, written on behalf of Father Curtis. At the time his ordination drew near, so he went to seminary briefly. Curtis did at St. Mary's Seminary, Baltimore. At that time, that seminary was just like 2 blocks south of Mount Calvary Church, so kind of back to his old stomping grounds in a sense. But when he was approaching ordination to the Catholic priesthood, Mr. Curtis wrote to his venerable friend, Dr. Newman, acquainting him with his approaching happiness, becoming a priest, and asking for his baptismal certificate, which the doctor kindly sent in his own handwriting, quoting from the life and characteristics of the Right Reverend Alfred A. Curtis, D.D., 2nd Bishop of Wilmington, Delaware, by the Visitation Nuns of Wilmington. So Father Curtis did serve as a priest in the Archdiocese of Baltimore and then was raised to the level of bishop, and he became the 2nd Bishop of Wilmington, Delaware, and was close friends with the Visitation Nuns who wrote his biography. So I just thought that was real special, and he's kind of a forerunner for us in the Ordinariate, especially at Mount Calvary Church, leading it, being a prophet and leading it eventually into the Catholic Church and into the Ordinariate. So Bishop Curtis, great man, great Catholic priest and bishop, and I pray for his soul whenever I remember to. To conclude, I know this very short look into Newman's writings, poetry, and letters is just the tip of the iceberg. I hope I have inspired you to pick up and read something by Newman. And in the next class, we will look at his prayers, meditations, and devotions, which is truly where the light of his sanctity shines brightest.